Thank you for joining today's session, The Future of End User Computing with Shawn Bass and Steve Greenberg, hosted by Sonnet.io. And now I'd like to hand it over to Dharmendra Mohan, CEO of Sonnet.io.
Yeah, thanks, Trish. And thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Dharmendra Mohan. I go by DM, co-founder and CEO of Sonnet.io. Sonnet.io is an industry-first end-user compute solution delivered as a SaaS service. At Sonnet.io, our goal is to make it easy for IT teams to set up and manage secure access to applications and data with a cloud-native solution that has zero trust security and visibility built in. Today, I'm very excited to have our advisor, Shawn Bass, chatting with Steve Greenberg. I had the opportunity to attend the EUC Unplugged event that Steve organized recently. We had some really good discussions around the challenges that the community faces and the future of end-user compute. We'll continue some of those conversations in this webinar today. It's so great to have you both here. I'll pass it over to Shawn to start the webinar. Shawn, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you. I did mute initially when you guys were talking and forgot to unmute. So thank you everyone for joining. My name is Shawn Bass, and I'm very fortunate to have Steve Greenberg here joining me to speak about the future of end user computing. And what I thought we would do initially is just kick off with a little bit about each of us in case you're not familiar with our work. I have been in the end user computing space for about 30 years. I spent 20 years in consulting. And I spent the last 8 to 9 years as CTO of the VMware End User Computing Group. And as DM mentioned, I am an advisor to Sonnet. And what I'd like to do is hand it over to Steve for an introduction. And Steve, you just came off of, I'm sure, a conference high, having hosted your event, EUC Unplugged. And maybe in addition to introducing yourself, you can tell the audience a little bit about EUC Unplugged.
Well, that's great, Shawn. Great to be here. Thanks for having me. So 30 years, you said, in the EUC space. Same here, just a little over 30. An official EUC nerd, started with the earliest products in this space and kind of rode the wave of everything that happened from the very, very first products from Citrix and other access technologies through virtualization and the many different twists and turns. It's been an incredible journey. And one of the best highlights of that journey has been solving customer problems and making technology do things for business, but also the incredible community that grew up around there. And that's how Shawn and I know each other, from this community that was conferences and NDA meetings and online interactions. So it's been a great 30 plus years, and it's great to go alongside with you there, Shawn. As far as EUC Unplugged, it's kind of the culmination of that community. What we've learned was that the connections between people are really, really important to people personally, but also to technical understanding and advancing the industry. So we've kind of used to have BRI Forum, more of an informal, independent conference. We lost that and some other key industry events. So seeing the need for that, we grew our Phoenix Metro user group into a conference. It started as a user group, which still exists, but it branched off into creating this conference, which now attracts people from around the world. And as Shawn said, we just finished our number 6 event over 8 years because COVID shut us down twice. And people came from literally around the world. We had 4 or 5 people from Australia, many people from Europe, UK, Germany, Netherlands, etc. And it's an incredible group, and there's a camaraderie. And we do it as deep tech, but also we do a lot of non-tech things, like go out for hikes and e-bike rides. And I went on a group. We did Arizona off-roading because I've got a built-up FJ Cruiser and some other guys. So it just becomes an incredible experience where you come from around the world and meet up, but you do other things and deepen relationships and connections. And DM came for the first time, so we had a great time with DM, and he fit right in.
Nice. Yeah, I heard a lot of great things from DM about the conference. I unfortunately was not able to attend. I had family in town. But I definitely had FOMO looking at LinkedIn and Twitter and seeing all the posts of different sessions that people were doing. So I wish I could have been there in person, but I'm also deeply honored to have received that award from you for kind of Lifetime Achievement Award for End User Computing. That was very, very meaningful to me. So thank you for that award.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean you're old and it's the end of the road. I just want to be clear. This is really just the beginning, and it's well deserved because as a consultant, for many years, you really contributed to the best practice pool. That was something that we were peers on. We were out doing real projects that were difficult, and we would work with each other and a group of other people. So I think you've deserved a lot of recognition for that. But as you moved into the product space, you also then could take that field knowledge and shape products, which shapes an industry, because when one vendor starts to do something, the other ones go, hey, why are they doing that? So it's really had a huge effect, and that's a very well-deserved award. So thank you for all you've done. And let's jump in. What are we doing?
Yep. All right, so we've got a number of different questions that we put into the webinar that we were going to address. And let's kick off with the first one, which is how recent events in the EUC industry are affecting customers and partners. And one of them that I thought was really interesting that occurred probably a couple of months ago is Amazon putting out their own thin client for workspaces. And I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that, because that's one of the first times that one of the big three cloud providers that also does end user compute kind of went in the direction of a purpose-built device. I mean, I say repurpose built because it was the original Fire TV device, but I want to get your thoughts on that.
Well, it's very significant. And what was interesting, it was easy to brush it off or think it's inconsequential, but I really jumped on it and started to socialize a discussion around it, because it represents everything we might talk about today: the transformation of society and technology and business, our economies. I mean, when I started thin client computing, 1997, I was doing Citrix before then, so we were both 30 years or so. Amazon was just a startup that was selling essentially books, and now we see that what it's become is a multi-trillion-dollar market cap entity who makes its most profits from AWS, from cloud services, which is unbelievable. When you think of the scale of its retail operation, it's actually making the most money from cloud, from technology. And then I always joke that things go in and out of vogue. So in the 90s, we called this thin client server-based computing, and then we called the devices thin clients, and then it becomes passé and it comes back in. But all these years later, to have Amazon release a thin client and call it that is an incredible circle. But it also shows the massive transformations that have occurred. When in 1997, when I started the company, it was built on a traditional fulfillment model where there's ISVs, hardware, software, distribution companies, things like Ingram Micro is the most well-known one, and then authorized resellers who were qualified and trained to understand these products, bring them to customers, integrate them, and deliver them, also normally sell them. So this is just a symbol of how the entire world has changed, where a giant megalithic company can be doing an enterprise technology and also be the entire supply chain.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not only that Amazon has a thin client and has workspaces, which is a great offering at scale, it also can fulfill its thin client and its services to its clients, customers, through its fulfillment model. So it can ship it to your employee, just like you ship any package you get. So it couldn't be more significant. It's the symbol of where our world has evolved and changed dramatically. And for EUC, it's the start of a next era where the largest companies literally in the world are dictating platforms and approaches, and us as the sort of the peasants need to continue to figure out how to add value to those services and make them work for our clients. So I think it's of huge significance that I think will almost play into everything we talk about today.
It's funny, Steve, when you talked about things going in and out of being in vogue, it's kind of funny because you think about like the mainframe era with the green screens, and in a lot of ways that was a thin client. It was a dumb terminal, and the market moved away from that to the PC era and client server and the Wintel monopoly and all that type of stuff. But in a lot of ways, VDI is sort of swing the pendulum back to this notion of centralized compute, much like cloud computing has as well. So it's quite interesting. I do want to talk a little bit too, because you talked about some of the big sort of huge mega companies. There's been a lot of disruption in the EUC space in the last couple of years. Citrix was taken private equity in 2022. VMware was acquired by Broadcom. EUC has been spun out. We now know the official name is Omnissa. That's been being in the process of being acquired by KKR. And then there's a ton of other ISVs in the EUC space that have gone through their own acquisitions and those types of things. So I wanted to get your thoughts on the EUC market in general and sort of this consolidation and private equity transition. What are your thoughts on what that all means?
Yeah, well, I would say the state is a kind of a wait and see right now. So much has changed so dramatically. We, as customers, as integrators, as consultants and experts and providers, we all have to like look at the landscape. So it's very, very different. I think that Citrix and VMware and others have brought tremendous value to the industry, in many ways invented the category. And you know, we rode a wave of that technology, and now there's just a lot of questions, honestly, is what I would say. It's kind of a reassessment phase. It doesn't mean those things go away, but in the case of Citrix, their technology is better than ever, and they're investing in the product stack like you would always want them to, probably maybe better than in the past. But they are also focusing their business on certain size customers, you know, certain maybe prime, highest profit, highest
It's pretty typical private equity playbook.
Right, right. So if you're an enterprise player, you're committed to the platform, you're probably getting better products and you're getting focus, but that leaves an entire, I would say, even ecosystem of small mid customers needing to know what to do. So it's kind of a time of questioning. A lot of people have to ask what they want to do. And then there's also sentiment, right? So there's a tendency for people to get pissed off when a vendor changes or raises prices or restricts something in some way. And both Citrix and VMware are perceived as doing that, both on the business side and the community side. So that has to shake out. But having said that, I think we're in an incredible period of opportunity. Having these large players I referred to, like the multi-trillion-dollar cap players, providing services gives a validity. It gives a mainstream element to all of the things that we've done as specialized nerds over the years. And there's tremendous opportunity. The question is, what is it and how do we get there? One thing I posited at EUC Unplugged in my vision keynote was that it's an era for all the non-titans, everyone else who makes up the EUC ecosystem, actually to partner together and improve the solutions that the large players are doing and bring them to people in ways that are more consumable. Like, for example, large Titan players will always want you to use their platform, so they won't necessarily design for interoperation or ease of management. So players that have tools that can work on multiple clouds is a good example of what I'm saying. So now you give benefit to the customer. So you have to kind of look at the new landscape, examine it, and see where the opportunity is.
Now, Steve, in your explanation there, you touched on community, and I know that you've spent a substantial amount of time not only contributing to, you know, conferences over the years, but actually kind of leading and running your own, you know, your own conference in your own community in the Phoenix area. So I wanted to ask too, what you think these changes in the end user computing landscape, what impacts they've had on the community in general? Well,
I think it's pretty much ended the community as we knew it, Shawn, and came up. And it isn't just the Citrixes and VMwares. One of the most important factors in our EUC worldwide community of a deep bond of experts you take for granted was Twitter. Twitter was the place we all met as, you know, blogs and social media evolved. Everybody in our space got into Twitter early, and it was pure Twitter. It wasn't what am I eating? And here's a picture of silly things. We use Twitter to communicate. And so that's gone as well. So you've got these company-sponsored community programs. You got a kind of a basic platform. So it's leaving people on their own. And another element that we talked about at EUC Unplugged is this new era of EUC independence. So we have to stop thinking and going forward, because the world has changed, that it's going to be a product vendor that kind of props up the community and funds it and supports it and have it come from the grassroots up. EUC Unplugged is probably the leading example of that, because we were already doing that. We were already branded EUC. But in response to the changes in community, World of EUC has come together as a not-for-profit and is looking to fill the gap of community connection without being dependent on corporate product providers. Now, they do receive sponsorship, but it's different than something like an experts or a CTP program, which is directly funded by a corporation. So it's an era of independence. It's an era of new opportunity. So I would say it's kind of an open landscape at this point. Now, I'm being very factual there on a personal level. It was very hurtful for many people. That's another thing that we talked about at EUC Unplugged, was acknowledging the incredible effort. There's people that put in 10, 15 years of their lives as their hobby or a part of their job or part of their identity and connected. And, whether they spent many hours on forums or speaking at conferences or being on webinars. So it's really like having a rug pulled out from under you. So it's important to acknowledge that and to say, once again, to everybody in that position, thank you. We know that the effort that was done and the great bonds that were created, things have changed. We just have to kind of find a new way to navigate.
So I guess the takeaway that you're saying is, if you're not involved in one of these independent community organizations, whether it's EUC Unplugged event, World of EUC, get engaged, contribute,
Yes.
keep the community strong. And I think the EUC community is still very strong. I mean, a lot of changes have occurred over the years, but I think it's still a very strong community.
Yeah, I agree. And also think locally. Everything seems so global and at scale, but I think it's important to find the people that and that you can get together with in person or virtually. And just a community starts with 2 or 3. And that's how our community started, was just a local Phoenix group. And we just invited all of our friends that were in the industry and built it up. So don't think it has to be expensive, or it's really about building a community with like interests.
I have to also give a plug and shout out to Alex Cooper at ETEVC, who has been running his conference for, I don't know, probably 20 years now. And that event began with 4 people meeting in a bar talking Citrix technology. Right. And now it's an event that's hosted multiple times per year in different cities and has, 100, 200, 300 people that attend the event. So if you're not familiar with ETEVC, that's another great independent conference, primarily focused in Europe, although they do sometimes do events in the US and in Asia as well. So get engaged. Everyone can offer something to share about your experiences and keep the community strong. Excellent. So the other thing I wanted to touch on with you, Steve, in particular, you've been part of sort of the partner ecosystem for decades now. You've been running Client Computing out in Arizona for a very long time. And so you've seen a lot of changes come and go with the different EUC vendors. And I wanted to pick your brain a little bit on, what do you think really makes a great partnership between an independent software vendor, call it a Citrix, a VMware, an iGel, a ControlUp, you name it, and their consulting partners, their resale partners, their go-to-market partners? What do you feel like is like the best thing they can do to really create a strong bond with you as a partner?
Well, I'll get to that, but I want to make a comment that it's subject to the same societal change I referred to earlier. Nowadays, if you want to contact a company, you have support or an issue, like you can't even find a phone number, right? So the world has changed to a kind of a self-service SaaS consumer model with limited kind of interaction and support. And I think that's affecting this area as well. But to answer you briefly, and then I'll comment, is it's really a mutual benefit situation. Is you need to look at how everyone benefits. So a proper ISV reseller relationship is actually 3-way. It's what helps the interest of the ISV, the reseller, and most importantly, the customer. Because after many years of doing this, if you meet the needs of the client and you meet or exceed what they need, everybody else prospers. And I think what's broken down here pretty much steadily from the 90s to now, we had a good run into the 2000s, is that idea of public companies and shareholder value trumping the other values. And so what's happened is most of these companies, I really can't think of any that haven't, cannibalized their customer and their channel to improve their profits. And it's kind of missing the boat, because it's a better number in the short term, but you lose loyalty and commitment. And so the short answer is the ISV needs to have a loyalty and a commitment to the partner and make it profitable for them. But to be frank, because you're asking, we want to talk frankly to the industry, that's eroded steadily for a very, very long time, for many years, to where the partners aren't really given the kind of margins that are workable to run a business on. Because we've always been strong on consulting and support and service, and we've expanded Think Client Computing to also do 24/7, kind of management monitoring. We've shifted to services. My company's fine, but you don't make money by selling product. So the short answer is help resellers make money by selling your product. It seems basic, but the channel has been subject to that same change of I hate to say it this way, but it's kind of a greedy corporate mindset, honestly, is really
when you talk about margin on product, the first thing that pops in my mind is the transformation that's occurred, going back probably as far as 10 years, but really more aggressively in the last 5 years, of ISVs moving from perpetual product to subscription ARR bookings.
Right.
And that's impacted customers because they've had to shift from CapEx budgets to OpEx budgets and manage that. But it's also impacted partners in a big way as well, in terms of how you're able to have margin on things, how you're part of the process of renewing with the customer and upselling, cross-selling. So I'd love to get your thoughts on how that shift from perpetual to subscription, SaaS subscriptions has changed the partner ecosystem.
Yeah, I'll speak very generally because every product and company is going to be slightly different. But the trend has been what I was referring to there. So more specifically, you would, as a partner, you would advise, choose, provide products, and then fulfill them, and then process the renewal generally. With the subscription model, not that this is inherent in subscription, but almost the vast majority of the companies have made it so that you can sell that maybe that first year or that first contract, but the reseller is pretty much minimized and cut out over time. So there isn't a long-term interest in the partner. And that's, again, getting back to how do you have a successful partnership? Everyone needs to prosper. So while the customers tend to talk about a sentiment of feeling the subscription is squeezing them, it demonstrably is to the partners as well. Customers are getting frustrated too, because it wasn't a like for like. It was a little bit of a shell game. We're going to get real honest today. Is that okay?
That's perfectly fine.
Okay. There's a little bit of a shell game in the last few years where we're going to say we're going to subscription and this is great for everyone. It's kind of like when parents get divorced and tell their kids it's for the better.
Yeah.
But when that shift occurs, they've been minimizing the partner piece of that, but also generally raising the price. And that's gone unnoticed for a while because of the novelty and the hype. But the reality is, when you analyze the cost, it's generally much higher with a subscription, especially after that first 2 or 3 years, because now it's a full cost every year. And I'm starting to see that backlash. So I don't think a subscription in itself is problematic or bad. It's just, it's been a little bit overpriced, and it's also been a change in a delivery that does affect the channel. I'd say certainly for the worse.
Well, one thing that something that you said just kind of triggered something in my mind that I wanted to bring up is there's a difference between a subscription purchase of something that's merely a financial transaction of an existing piece of software versus consuming something that truly is a SaaS platform.
Yes.
And I don't want to nitpick on particular vendors about how they do things, but if something is truly software as a service, there's an implied value to the customer that new features are being slipstreamed constantly to them. Sometimes hourly, sometimes daily, probably at a minimum weekly. But that brings up, I think, a very important differentiation of, is the software that you're receiving a subscription on truly a SaaS platform where it's modern, cloud native, and features are coming in as new code gets committed, or is it a legacy product architecture that has merely been shifted to the cloud and built out as a a SaaS operated cloud subscription? Because those are very different things in terms of how the customer receives new value.
Yeah.
Because with a legacy application running as a cloud platform, you know, there's still that legacy notion of planned upgrades and downtime and, you know, we'll upgrade you every month or something like that. That's not really what the promise of SaaS delivers. So I'd love to get your thoughts on how that difference affects the customer and the partner.
I think that's a great observation. It is subtle, but people know it. And I think some of the frustration with clients of being forced into subscription is that they're getting the same thing they got with a perpetual product, right? So I think that's your point. And instead of paying 18% a year, they're paying the full cost every year and feeling like they get the same thing. However, when they then consume something that is truly SaaS, is truly a service, they have a different perception. They feel like I'm consuming a service. I'm not maintaining that infrastructure. I'm not the one doing the patching, and that seems appropriate. Now, as you said, it could be a financial transaction and not be qualitatively different, but there is a difference there, and I think people feel it. But I think the pain is when you're paying subscription for something that is really an on-prem perpetual product that you maintain, patch, and when a new platform comes out, you have to do a project to deploy the platform versus just log in on Monday and it's there. I think that's a
great point.
Good observation.
Well, since we talked about SaaS and subscriptions, I thought it'd be a good time for us to pivot to cloud computing. And you know, the general topic we're going to discuss is how is cloud computing accelerating the adoption of new technologies? And you know, we talked a little bit about something being true SaaS and how features can just get rolled out, you know, dramatically fast. But there are a lot of legacy software stacks out there. But one of the things that I wanted to touch on too is something that you mentioned earlier about like the titans of the industry, the big three cloud providers, so to speak. You know, you've talked a lot about the titans in your EUC Unplugged keynote. I'm just curious, like, how you think those titans versus the other ecosystem players are going to operate and what this means potentially for the future of end user compute.
Yeah. Well, they're definitely going to be a major force. There's no doubt about that. I don't think any of them will fail. I think their scale and their growth speaks to the demand and the general overall acceptance of, you know, the idea of public cloud as a valid platform. So I think it will succeed and it will grow. So that's the first thing. In terms of the adoption of technologies for us, I think the first layer is having to learn their methods, right? So I'm in an honest mood and we have an old relationship. So I'm going to just drop things real straight. And you were one of the first people to call this out super early on, that VDI wasn't really ready when it wasn't ready. And it was being touted as doing things it couldn't do. Cloud's way better, but up until maybe now-ish, it's promised things that it wasn't really delivering. It would imply it's easier, right? And you give it to us and we own it. But most of it has really been infrastructure as a service, the lift and shift that you referred to earlier of doing them the same way, but moving into a new platform. So the first new technology that I think is important to think about and we all have to use are the methods for each of these providers' clouds, because they're not the same, right? And actually, they're less the same than maybe on-prem used to be, because you could pick up an engineer from on-prem who for decades worked on data centers. You can put them in any data center, and they're going to kind of do the same things. But when you go to a public cloud provider, you need to learn their method for doing it. Now, that also opens up the next layer of where are their gaps, right? So you learn their methodology. So that's a new technology. Then you have to evolve or adopt or use technologies to make those platforms do what you need. I think a great example is Nerdio and AVD, right? There's a whole company that's doing great because they can provide to the client or the integrator what you need to be able to do in AVD, right? And that's, I think, one of the characteristics of the titans. So I think in this next era, the new technologies are the things that fill in the gaps. And I think there are things like user personalization. I think Liquidware has a great suite for this time because they can deliver flex apps. They can, abstract applications as some kind of layer, deal with user personalization, so forth. You've got Control Up out there doing a great job with monitoring and understanding user experience. I think user experience is going to be a new focus. That's always been something in our practice that we've really focused on, but it's becoming a thing, and the rise of DEX. So I think there's kind of a fuller stack of technology. It's not good enough to deploy stuff. You have to now monitor its quality and user experience. So that's where I think and that's not real technical, but that's the categories I think that the technology is emerging in.
So two thoughts popped in my head as you were going through that. Number one, the old saying that no new technology, and I'll use cloud computing in this case, ever replaces an old technology. It just adds a new set of things that you do, and next thing you know, you've got 20 more things to do than you did before.
That's exactly right.
And you didn't eliminate any of the technology. So that was the first thing that popped in my head. Right. The second thing that popped in my head was, we talk about these titans as being, just magnificent in size and scope and engineering talent, and how can any ISVs exist around these titans? But the one thing that pops in my mind is like, how quickly one of these titans can shift the focus of their company away from something they were doing before onto the new hot thing. And next thing you know, there's a huge opportunity for a whole bunch of other ISVs to fill the gaps. And the most obvious thing staring us in the face right now is AI. Every cloud company is shifting an immense amount of resources into all things AI. And in some cases, the budget to work on AI is coming from other things in the portfolio. So I think the opportunity for EUC ISVs is still very strong, because the big companies can very easily get distracted on their top 2 or 3 priorities that these EUC things may not fit into.
I think you're spot on. There's also things that they'll never do because it's not in their interest that the customer needs.
Yeah, good point. Right. Good point.
Yeah. No, that's excellent. So I do think the building on what I said and what you're saying, the future really needs to be, we always used to joke and say, make things work automagically. But I think that is the future, because there's too much complexity behind the hood for everyone. So the specialists now, and we've always done that as EUC experts, we've hid the complexity from the client, or at least handled it for them so we can hand off something that's manageable. I think that doesn't go away, and it actually becomes worse. And the EUC ecosystem players who might feel like, geez, these guys are taking all the business, what do I do? Well, they got to look at for how they can improve the client's ability to maybe run their desktops in Azure and AWS, right? That's actually a difficult thing. That's something that Azure and AWS don't really want to do, and don't have an interest in interoperability and making it easy for the customer to go to the other player. So there's a huge opportunity there. You don't want to have all your eggs in one basket. That's not a new dynamic. You mentioned AI. I don't know what I should say or shouldn't say, but I'm going to have a frank conversation with you today. I'm in a frank mood today. We had Vishal and team at EUC Unplugged from NVIDIA, just fantastic guys. Their roadmap and what they have accomplished and what they're doing in vGPU and GPU acceleration for EUC is just absolutely remarkable. Their new kind of profiles they're having, asymmetrical profile. There's so many great things going on, but they had difficulty coming to the conference because the company's focused on AI. And for how many years has NVIDIA been all about vGPU and user experience and enabling all this? But now there's a new thing. It's AI. It's a perfect example of what you're saying. They're not moving away from it. It's just that the guys don't get the same.
There was someone with a bigger wallet that came by.
Exactly. Right. Exactly.
Interesting. All right. I want to spin up a topic that's definitely one that has been discussed and debated for about 20 years or so, or close to 20 years. But I want to get your take on this. And it's the old conversation of VDI versus server-based computing, or VDI versus RDSH, and which one's better, which one's going to win out in the long term. And maybe to take a slightly different angle of well, these are the pros of VDI, or these are the pros of server-based computing. What I want to talk about is kind of how the application mix is changing dramatically
Right.
over the last, probably 10 years or so. So many more web and SaaS apps. And don't get me wrong, I'm going to be pragmatic here and say that rarely does a web or SaaS app completely replace an existing legacy thick client application. It sometimes is additive. But with the change of mix of applications and more applications going web and SaaS, we never did truly get to that network computer that, Larry Ellison and Scott
Right.
McNeely were preaching. But the question is, like, at some point in time, for some subset of customers and some subset of use cases, is it practical to think that a browser could be the only thing the user needs, and the handful of apps they still need that are thick client based could be served out of a server-based computing environment?
Yeah, I mean, I want to say it depends because it does, but I think the short answer is yes. I think there are many use cases that can evolve to browsers. It is generational too. There's an age and a generational aspect, but functionally, there are many situations that essentially a set of browsers and maybe access to a couple of proprietary Windows 32, 64 apps will do the job. However, having said that, in my slice of the world, working with, companies, real companies that may have been in business for 5, 10, or 20 or 30 years, they still have a lot of apps that are Windows. Now, they have a lot of SaaS. I mean, the number is the greatest I've ever seen it, but there's still this number of apps, and then you get into this whole legacy question. But I think the short answer, to be succinct, is yes. And to the extent that you need to deliver legacy, we have all the technologies for that and published apps and other things. But there are new paradigms that are coming out that aren't even necessarily binary. So Sonnet being one of the great examples of a true service based on native cloud API and proprietary intellectual property, where it does come to you in the context of a browser, but it seamlessly integrates, so it doesn't matter anymore. To your point, I can be running SaaS in these tabs, and then dedicated application in this tab, and even a desktop in this tab. So some of the distinctions are blurring. And as I said, I think it's generational. We still, in our age group, want a desktop. That's where we think of our workspace, as a desktop. I don't think the younger people are. They grew up in a web world. They grew up with fungible devices. I have this phone today, and tomorrow it's a different one. And so I think it's changing. But as you said earlier, in my version of the quote is, good technology never goes away. It just goes to the back of the data center. It is layering. If we could start fresh, it would look much more like you're saying, but we're not really starting over unless you're starting over. And if you are starting over or starting up, I think you can get into enterprise technology in a whole different way. And again, Sonnet as a great example, a startup company today does not need to adopt all those legacy things that we're concerned with. Worst case, if you want to go mainstream, you put all your people on Microsoft 365, you have your productivity suite, and then you can use some sort of SaaS desktop service, or you could do the whole thing web, as you said. A whole generation of people are fine running Microsoft Word and Excel in a browser.
I think you're spot on when you say it is generational, because I remember as my daughters were going through learning different technology, and they're in their early 20s right now, like, I made sure they had a PC in their room to do their homework, and I made sure they had the full, Office suite. And I try to explain to them how the locally installed versions of Word, Excel, and PowerPoint were better than the web equivalents. And that was definitely true in the early days of Office 365. But, in school, they had access to, G Suite, as it was called back in the time. And like, they just never thought to pick up a full thick client version of an app. Like, there was nothing they needed to do their work that couldn't be accomplished in the web browser. And so the interesting thing about the generational impact is that those generations of people are going through the workforce now, and the generations that were accustomed to a desktop operating system and thick client applications, they're phasing out of the workforce. So as you look forward, 5, 10 years in the future, the majority of the workforce is going to be millennial and Gen Z and some subset of Gen X. And it's interesting to think about like what will the expectations be, and will people start to dictate where they work based on what technology is offered to them.
Well, I can offer you the anecdote of we have clients that have really complex application suites that were, poorly designed and proprietary and require like a lot more interaction between go to this app, go to this screen.
Yeah.
Sort of old school, almost mainframe, like changing screens, although it's on a PC. And they can't retain new employees. The employees will start training and they'll quit. Say, this system sucks. I can't do this all day.
Wow.
So I think they're voting with their feet about where they're willing to work. And I think digital enablement is a employment satisfaction factor.
Well, there's the old adage of never let a developer create a UI.
Right.
All right, last question. I want to make sure we get some time for Q&A. So those that are on the webinar, if you've got questions for Steve or I, please post them in the Q&A and we'll get to them in just about 5 to 7 minutes. So Steve, last question for you. When I did a webinar with Dane Young not too long ago, I talked about like what the must-have technologies are within EUC project. And Dane talked about multiple different aspects of EUC adjacent technologies. But I wanted to change the question up and ask you, like if you were to narrow it down to what are the 1 or 2 things that you always find that you need to deploy into a successful EUC project, whether it's what you're deploying from the vendor of choice or where you're having to add on a third-party ISV in order to make the solution function and meet user expectations. What is that 1 or 2, maybe 3 things that you say are absolute must that go with every successful project?
Well, I want to answer it with some real sexy emerging technologies, and we do a lot of those things with protocols and network design, internet pathing, redundancy. But I hate to say it, after all these years, the thing that you must do and often requires third party of some form is to deal with policy profiles and printing. And it's always been the joke of the EUC industry that this just keeps coming. But the reason it keeps coming is it gets solved and then it gets unsolved over and over and over again. And I know it sounds almost like the old guy ranting, yelling at the clouds or something, but it's really current. Like we're working right now on a hospital deployment where that's a challenge. And it just whatever the reason is, the vendors, the operating system providers, the ISVs, the third party add-ons, it just doesn't, the target doesn't stay still for long enough for you to solve it and continue to solve it. Now, I don't mean that we don't solve it. It's just that every 6 months or a year, we have to revert. We had a great run with FS Logics for profiles. I was involved as an investor early on. I could help influence the product. It was great. Microsoft bought it. It was fine for a while. Then it had all kinds of issues. We had to go elsewhere. FS Logics got better. Citrix UPM profiles had issues, became better. So it's this changing landscape. And it's just crazy because it's so basic. But in terms of the fun stuff, the evolution of automation, we're doing more and more like Ansible automation, DevOps styles deployment, where we create the environment in code. That's some of the fun stuff that we're doing now for every project that's kind of essential. We've extending it to other kinds of workloads. We've had cool search situations where the customers go, hey, I know you guys aren't really SQL people, but we have all these problems. We have to build new clusters. We have to move a bunch of data. And then we jump in and then we automate it. And then we've been able to use that for other projects or customers or even other projects at the customer. Okay. So this one customer, their SQL guy left. They needed some help with unsupported old versions of OSs and SQLs. And it was a complex step because you can't do direct upgrades. So Joe Shonk and I worked together. He automated a multi-step process to bring clusters forward. Then the customer needed to do an AD migration, and we had that technology. So the fun, sexy part is automation, DevOps style approaches, but the nuts and bolt daily thing you must do for every project is solve for user experience. And in the basic area of user personalization and printing and everything, it doesn't stay still. It's
Yeah.
just a problem.
You know, it's interesting that you talked specifically about how cyclical this problem has been, because I think a lot of people who have witnessed EUC over the years have sort of written off printing and profiles and policies as being a done deal. Like, why is this still a problem? And I think, you know, you touched on an important aspect of it, is that the applications are continuing evolving, both new applications coming in and applications being upgraded to new technology stacks. The operating systems, of course, are making major changes into the platforms and the technologies involved. And so while we might have thought that printing and profiles and policies were 100% solved, because all this technology keeps marching on and keeps morphing, it's an ever revolving set of problems that we keep having to relive. So that's interesting. I also wanted to ask you about, you said that your company is doing a lot of Ansible work. Are you also doing Terraform work as part of that? And I'd love to get your thoughts on IBM acquiring HashiCorp.
No, not so much. Our stuff still tends to be well contained into a typical enterprise environment, whether it's cloud or on-prem. So a couple of key tools, Ansible, Packer, things like that are really sufficient. So I haven't played too much in the Terraform space. I think IBM buying HashiCorp is interesting, and yet another example of this Titan element, right? The huge company sort of owning the core technology. I think it's got great potential and it will lead to good things, but it's not something that we deal with in our practice a lot.
Got it. Okay, thanks. All right, so I want to jump into a question that was asked related to, you probably saw this news, I think it might have been like a month or 2 months ago. Google announced this new sort of Chrome for Enterprise, and it's the Chrome browser with an entire set of policies that in some ways sort of moves Google closer to this enterprise browser initiative that we've certainly seen independent vendors, well, not all of them are independent anymore, but Island has been pushing enterprise browser, Talon, who was acquired by Palo Alto, Surf Security, and there's a whole myriad of other smaller players are investing in the enterprise browser market. And I'm curious on what your thoughts are on enterprise browser, and then I'll share some of my thoughts on it as well, because I've been seeing a lot happen in that space.
Okay, well, I really want to hear your thoughts. I'll say in general, I think it's an exciting space. I think the idea makes sense, that I think most or all of what you need can essentially be delivered in a browser. It still needs to evolve. But I think one of the challenges that actually plays into something you were hitting on earlier with VDI versus server-based computing and platforms is the browsers are incredibly resource intensive. So it's not for free, right?
Yeah.
This functionality is great, but it's often taking several gigs of memory per user. And the browser is actually forcing the use of VDI in some cases, just because of the resource intensivity, and some of the apps and familiarity tend to lend itself more to a VDI use case than server-based computing use case. As an architect and I monitor systems, I think a lot about resources. So functionality-wise, I'm with you, enterprise browser, containerization for security and execution and runtime, I think is amazing. It is actually, you hit on an old vision of like Java and Oracle and Sun. The network is the computer. And I think the browser is getting us there after many, many years. But I think the resource requirement is a real factor.
Got it. Yeah, so I wanted to say my kind of thoughts in general about the enterprise browser space. There's obviously a lot of startups that are in this space. Island just announced, I think today, that they closed their Series D funding, valuing that at $3 billion. So a lot of venture money getting poured into enterprise browsers. And I've been a big proponent or believer that more and more apps are going web and SaaS, and the dependency on a thick client application or a full-blown Windows desktop is declining over time. Now, I'm also pragmatic in recognizing that the 30 or 40 million Windows apps that exist are not going to go away in the next year or two. It's going to be decades, but that trend is happening, that more things are moving web and SaaS. So will we ever get to the network PC or everything's in the browser? Probably not in the next 10 or 15 years, but it's certainly marching in that direction. Now, the enterprise browser vendors always articulate that they are a VDI replacement, but I think the nuance in that is it would be true if all your applications were web and SaaS, because then your desktop is the browser and you don't need VDI. But I think the number of people that use VDI or server-based computing, they're not using it strictly to deliver web applications. There may be some out there, but a majority of them are using it to deliver thick client applications of some sort.
Right.
So you're still going to need some form of VDI or server-based computing to deliver those thick client applications to an enterprise browser. So back to the earlier comment we talked about, where it's like, it's not replacing something necessarily, it's more of an and don't get me wrong, there's a lot of work that needs to happen in securing the browser in some way, shape, or form to be able to add the security controls that people need to control upload and download of data, to control copy and paste, to be able to have the enterprise security constraints, particularly in cases where you've got BYOD and maybe you don't have endpoint management down on the system. You need some way of controlling that externally. And it's either going to happen through an enterprise browser or by hosting the apps in some type of a centralized fashion, or by something in between, a proxy, a SASE offering, a Zscaler of sorts. You're going to need some way to do some form of security outside of just giving people access to all their web applications and saying, good luck, let us know how it goes.
Yeah, and I think
makes sense
earlier. Absolutely. I think you're hitting the nail on the head. You talked earlier about a possibility of SaaS and browser based as your primary workflow, but then you're consuming published apps or desktops alongside of it, and that's probably the realistic hybrid that you're referring to. But if companies are savvy, especially startups, they can create application sets that don't have the legacy. So we're getting back to this generational thing. The world has changed so fast that we have 3 or 4 or 5 generations living and working at the same time. Patrick Squires had an interesting comment: when a WinThick app looks like an AS400 mainframe app to a younger generation, I may get offended and local use groups may take new meaning. So that's true. So it is going to depend on what your application set is, the vintage of your company, your data processing, et cetera. But I do think everything's going to be hybrid until some distant future. The other great industry quote that we've lived by in EUC is from you, and that is, in the end, after nuclear war, there'll be cockroaches and Windows apps, right?
Yeah. and I still stand by that. And I think, honestly, in the remaining years of my working career, we're not going to see the sunset of all Windows applications. Like it's going to take probably at least 1 to 4 decades before like no company is using any Windows apps. And the reason I say that is, like, people were talking about the importance of the web and that it was going to replace all thick client applications in the 2000s. That was 20 years ago. And here we are, and like there's still 30 or 40 million Windows apps. Like it's going to take forever for that stuff to go away. But what I use as kind of the indicator of why things are moving in that direction is look at all of the new development efforts for net new applications. Nobody is building a new Windows app today. They're building progressive web apps. They're building web and SaaS platforms. Like no one is building client server traditional style applications. Even those that are building a thick client application, they're building them with web frameworks to make them operate as web apps, even though there is some client side code.
Right.
So I want to shift. Another question that got asked was specifically about something that Microsoft put out, and this might have been probably, I'm going to mess up the time frame here, probably 6 to 12 months ago. And this was a feature of Azure Virtual Desktop where they enabled you to have a offline mode of AVD, where you can download your cloud-based PC to your local compute environment, run it offline, obviously targeting the use case of you're an executive on an airplane that has to be able to work without internet access. And then you check the VM back into the cloud when you get high-speed connected and that type of stuff. And I wanted to ask you about this because there has been no shortage of vendors who have tried some variant of this technology. If I think back to probably the oldest version of it, VMware had something called ACE, and it was basically a managed corporate VM that could be downloaded and run on a BYOD device, and it was segregated personal versus work. That product got killed in sunset, and then it came back in VMware as something called View Local Mode. And then there was another release of it that came out later. Citrix had their iterations of this with Zen Client. Their approach was a bit different, that it was a client-side hypervisor, but the idea was similar, that you'd have a client-side virtual machine running local apps. There was vendors like Mocha 5 that had their live PC technology. Like, there have been a ton of vendors that have built technologies that have been in this space of some form of localized VM compute. And Microsoft put this feature into AVD with the notion that you would transmit bits of this VM back and forth. And I guess my question to you is, do you see the use case? I mean, put aside the idea that you need a local compute environment. No one's going to argue that. If you need to work on an airplane, or you need to work where you don't have connectivity, you have to have localized compute. My question for you is, do you see enough client or customer demand that they would want to shift states between the localized compute and the cloud compute? Like, what's the use case that drives that decision?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is a technology that I'm a huge fan of and think it has a lot of valuable uses, but it hasn't quite gotten over the obstacles of maybe data size or synchronization or local resource requirements. So I'm disappointed. I like this use case a lot. I think realistically, it's probably not the main use case. If you took the, what's the 80% use case at any given company or set of companies, it's probably not the main use case, but I think it's a valuable one for also for user experience, right? Because if you have a capable local machine, nowadays they have GPUs and high resolution screens, and I think it'd be better to run locally. Everyone prefers to own their device and have it be the latest, greatest model. I don't know. I mean, I'd probably put it at 10 to 15, at most 20% of the use case. So I think that's
I guess the one use case that pops into my mind on where this would be helpful is, let's say you do have a laptop that's very powerful, GPU, 8-core, 16-core, gigs of RAM, and you're operating on your local VM, but then you want to leave your device at your office, go visit family, friends, and you might want to pop onto one of their computers and do some work, but you don't want to carry your laptop around with you. You could just go to any web browser, sign into a virtual desktop, have all your data and all your apps there, and do your work from a browser interface without having your device with all your data. But I feel like for the vast majority of people, either you're going to carry your laptop most places if you have to work, or because of the prevalence of web and SaaS applications and most of your data and most of your stuff being accessible from the cloud, I'm not sure I still totally understand where this use case fits a customer demand.
Well, I mean, like right here, Beth, who does all of our accounting, is only here part-time. She works most of the time, but is only here part-time. And so as a result, we have our accounting system up in, I make her the guinea pig for every platform. She's in Windows 365 running QuickBooks, and that's so that universally she can access it. But when she comes here, she's getting the degraded experience of cloud hosted when she could be sitting on a nice computer and working. So I think it's kind of people with multiple locations and different work modes.
Yeah.
I think that's a great use case, but again, how much of the population is that? Does it justify it? I think it's a really solid deployment. I also don't think there's any reason for you to execute it in the cloud if you have resources.
Yeah.
So you may be able to save on compute cost as well. If you've already issued somebody an endpoint, why not use it? But it's going to be a small use case.
We're almost at time, so I want to give you one last quick comment. And for everyone that joined, thank you for joining. We'll be sending the recording out to everyone. If you want to watch this, or if you had to drop off early and want to catch it. Steve, last probably 20, 30 seconds. What's your thought about the state of the end user computing industry?
It's fantastic. It's a wild west. It's a wide open opportunity. The bold are going to succeed like we've never seen before. So don't look back, don't hold on. Connect to community, connect to your peers, connect to us, send us messages, say hi, and keep forging forward, because the next 10 years is going to be very exciting and creative and profitable.
Awesome. Steve, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful discussion with you. I was really excited for this one, and it has not disappointed. So thanks so much for making the time for us.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
Take care. Thanks, everyone.